Have you ever wondered what happened to that one teacher who changed your life? The one who saw something in you that nobody else did, not even yourself? For Michael Chen, that question was never far from his mind, even as he built a tech empire worth millions. His high school English teacher, Mr. Wilson, had been more than just an educator. He had been the first person to truly believe in a quiet immigrant kid with broken English and dreams too big to speak aloud. But what do you owe the person who gave you a future when you had nothing to offer in return? For 17 years, Michael thought he knew the answer, silently paying off Mr. Wilson's mortgage month after month, a secret act of gratitude for the man who had sacrificed his own time and opportunities to help others. It was an arrangement that worked perfectly, until it didn't. When a banking error sent a revealing letter to Mr. Wilson's doorstep, it didn't just expose a financial transaction. It uncovered a bond that had silently persisted for nearly 2 decades. What happens when gratitude that was never meant to be acknowledged suddenly demands to be faced? This is a story about the debts we can never repay, the connections that define us, and the moment when a teacher and student must finally confront what they've meant to each other's lives. Michael Chen stared at his phone, the blue light illuminating his face in the darkness of his penthouse office. The skyline of San Francisco glittered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, but he wasn't seeing it. Instead, his focus was locked on an email that had arrived 4 minutes ago with a subject line that had stopped his breath. Robert Wilson, payment confirmation error. 17 years. For 17 years, he had maintained perfect anonymity. One payment every month, routed through a separate account, managed by his most trusted financial advisor who knew only that this particular arrangement was to remain absolutely confidential. And now, with one careless clerical error, everything was exposed. Michael set the phone down and swiveled his chair toward the window. At 43, he had accumulated more wealth than he had ever imagined possible growing up. Chentech Securities had gone public 3 years ago, turning the cybersecurity company he had built from his dorm room into a billion-dollar enterprise. He had the corner office, the penthouse apartment, the features in Forbes and Wired. By any conventional measure, Michael Chen had succeeded beyond even his own ambitious dreams. Yet among all his achievements, it was this secret, this monthly payment that represented a fraction of his wealth, that had given him the most profound satisfaction. The knowledge that somewhere in Millfield, Ohio, a high school English teacher who had changed the trajectory of his life could focus on caring for his ailing wife rather than worrying about losing their modest home. He picked up the phone again, rereading the email from his financial advisor. Mr. Wilson received direct confirmation of your identity due to a system migration error at First Midwest Banking. He has requested your contact information. How would you like me to proceed? A sudden memory surfaced. Mr. Wilson's classroom, the smell of chalk dust and old books, the way the afternoon light slanted through the Venetian blinds. Michael had been 16, hunched in the back row, trying to make himself invisible as he usually did. His family had been in America for just 4 years, and despite his rapidly improving English, he still felt the sting of his accent, the hesitation before he spoke that marked him as different. Mr. Chen, Mr. Wilson had called, holding up Michael's essay. Would you stay after class, please? Michael had been certain he was in trouble. Instead, Mr. Wilson had pulled up a chair beside him and said words that Michael still carried. You have a voice that deserves to be heard, and I'm going to help you make sure it is. Now, 17 years after he had begun repaying that debt in the only way he knew how, Michael was faced with a decision. He could continue to hide behind the shield of his wealth and success, direct his advisor to deny the request, perhaps increase the payments as compensation for the distress, or he could finally face the man who had first seen his potential and answer for what he had done. Michael's finger hovered over the reply button. Outside his window, fog was rolling in from the bay, shrouding the city lights, turning clarity into uncertainty. It felt fitting for the moment, a crossroads he hadn't anticipated reaching tonight, or perhaps ever. He began to type, "Please provide Mr. Wilson with my personal contact information, all of it." After sending the email, Michael opened his desk drawer and pulled out a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Inside the cover, handwritten in blue ink faded by time, "Language has power. Use yours wisely. Mr. Wilson." Michael closed the book and placed it in his briefcase. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing with certainty. He was no longer the frightened immigrant boy hiding in the back of a classroom. He was Michael Chen, and he was finally ready to say thank you in person. The morning light streamed through the blinds of Robert Wilson's kitchen as he sipped his coffee, trying to make sense of the letter that had arrived yesterday afternoon. At 68, he had long stopped expecting life to deliver surprises, pleasant ones at least. Retirement had been within reach once, but Mary's medical bills had changed all that. 3 bouts with cancer over 15 years had drained their savings, maxed out their credit cards, and nearly cost them the modest 3-bedroom house they had purchased as newlyweds 40 years ago. Yet somehow, miraculously, they had managed to keep making mortgage payments. Robert had attributed it to careful budgeting, to the extra summer school classes he took on, to Mary's talent for stretching every dollar until it screamed. Not once had he suspected that someone was helping them. Certainly not a former student he barely remembered teaching. "Are you still staring at that thing?" Mary asked, her slippers shuffling across the linoleum as she made her way to the coffee maker. She was thin now, too thin, her once vibrant red hair gone silver and sparse from years of chemotherapy. But her eyes still held the spark that had made him fall in love with her when they were both 22 and working at the same bookstore. "I just can't wrap my head around it, Mary," Robert said, pushing the letter toward her. "Michael Chen. The name sounds familiar, but I've taught thousands of students over 43 years, and he's been paying our mortgage for 17 years? Mary scanned the letter again, the formal banking language that somehow failed to capture the magnitude of what it was conveying. Due to a system error during their database migration, the bank regretted to inform Mr. Wilson that his confidential benefactor arrangement had been compromised, and that the individual making payments toward his mortgage account since 2007 was one Michael Chen, CEO of Chen Tech Securities. "You must have made quite an impression," Mary said softly. Robert shook his head. "But that's just it. I don't even properly remember him. I've been searching my memory all night. I have a vague recollection of a quiet Asian boy, maybe in the late 90s, but nothing that would explain this." He gestured at the letter, frustration evident in his voice. Robert had always prided himself on remembering his students. He kept a journal throughout his teaching career, jotting down names, memorable moments, achievements. He had flipped through the volumes from 1995 to 2000 last night, finding only 2 brief mentions of a Michael Chen. Exceptional writing skills, needs encouragement to participate, and later, Michael received MIT scholarship, promising future. Nothing that explained why this particular student would silently pay thousands of dollars every month for nearly 2 decades. "Well," Mary said, settling into the chair across from him with a wince that she tried to hide, "you have his contact information now. The bank included it. Why not just call him and ask?" Robert ran a hand through his thinning white hair. "What would I even say?" "Excuse me, Mr. Chen. Apparently you've been paying my mortgage for 17 years. May I ask why?" "It's absurd." "It's a gift, Bob," Mary said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Her fingers were cold, always cold these days. "An extraordinary one. Don't you think you owe it to him to at least say thank you?" Robert glanced around their kitchen, the same oak cabinets they'd installed in the 90s, the refrigerator covered with photos of their grandchildren, the stack of medical bills on the counter that never seemed to diminish no matter how many he paid. This house had been their sanctuary through Mary's illness, the one constant when everything else was uncertain. The thought that they had kept it not through his own efforts, but through the charity of a former student, stirred complex emotions: gratitude, Yes, but also shame, confusion, and a nagging sense that he had somehow failed in his responsibilities. "I'll think about it," he finally said, though they both knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he understood. Robert Wilson had spent his life helping young people find answers. He wouldn't be able to ignore this question hanging over his own life. As Mary began preparing breakfast, Robert picked up his phone and stared at the number on the bank letter. After several moments of hesitation, he slowly began to dial, unsure of what he would say but certain that he needed to say something. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's professional voice answered. "Mr. Chen's office. How may I direct your call?" Robert swallowed hard. "This is Robert Wilson. I believe Mr. Chen might be expecting my call." The flight from San Francisco to Columbus had given Michael 5 hours to rehearse what he would say, and 5 hours to realize that no rehearsal would be adequate. As the rental car's GPS directed him through the familiar streets of Millfield, Ohio, memories surfaced with each landmark: the corner store where he had bought cheap notebooks, the library where he had spent countless Saturday afternoons improving, his English, the park where he had never quite fit in with the other teenagers. Millfield hadn't changed much in 25 years. It was still the kind of small Midwestern town that existed in a peculiar stasis, neither growing nor declining, just persisting in its quiet, unassuming way. The high school appeared on his right, its red brick facade and white columns exactly as he remembered. Michael slowed the car, a sudden impulse to stop nearly overwhelming him. But that wasn't why he had come. Not yet, anyway. The GPS announced his arrival at his destination, and Michael parked in front of a single-story ranch, house with white siding and blue shutters. The front yard was small but meticulously maintained, with garden beds of spring flowers lining the walkway. For a moment he remained in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel. The brief phone conversation 2 days ago had been awkward, stilted. Mr. Wilson clearly as uncomfortable as Michael himself. "I believe we have something to discuss," Mr. Wilson had said, his voice exactly as Michael remembered it, measured and articulate. "Yes," Michael had replied. "I think we do. I can fly out. Would this weekend be convenient?" Now here he was, parked in front of his former teacher's house, about to face the man he had been anonymously helping for nearly 2 decades. Michael took a deep breath, grabbed the small gift bag from the passenger seat, and finally stepped out of the car. Before he could reach the front door, it opened, revealing Robert Wilson. He was older than Michael had pictured him, his hair now completely white, his tall frame slightly stooped, deep lines etched around his eyes. But those eyes were exactly the same, clear, observant, kind. The kind of eyes that had once seen potential in a struggling immigrant boy when no one else had bothered to look. "Mr. Wilson," Michael said, extending his hand. "Mr. Chen," the older man replied, taking it firmly. "Though I think under the circumstances you should probably call me Robert. Then I'm Michael." A pause. It's good to see you again." "Sir." Robert nodded, then gestured toward the open door. "Please come in. Mary's been looking forward to meeting you." The interior of the house was modest but comfortable, filled with bookshelves and family photos. In the living room, a thin woman with silver hair and a warm smile rose from an armchair. Despite her evident frailty, there was something resilient in her posture, in the directness of her gaze. "So you're the mysterious benefactor," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Mary Wilson. Would you like some coffee? Or perhaps something stronger? I think this conversation might warrant it." Michael smiled, feeling some of his tension ease. "Coffee would be perfect, thank you." As Mary disappeared into the kitchen, Robert directed Michael to the couch and took the armchair opposite. Between them sat a coffee table with a familiar book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and beside it, the bank letter that had brought Michael. "Here. I've been trying to place you properly," Robert began, his tone conversational but his eyes searching. "I remember you were in my AP English class, 1999, I believe. Quiet, very bright. You wrote an exceptional analysis of Atticus Finch's Moral Courage." Michael nodded. surprised that Robert remembered even that much. You gave me an A+ and wrote that I should consider a career in journalism or law. And instead, you built a technology empire, Robert observed, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. I looked you up after I received the letter. Quite impressive. I wouldn't have built anything if not for you, Michael said quietly. Robert's eyebrows rose. That seems difficult to believe given that I barely remember our interactions. Clearly, I've missed something significant. Mary returned with a tray of coffee cups, setting it down before taking the seat next to her husband. The silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions. Finally, Michael reached for the gift bag he had brought and handed it to Robert. This might help explain. I've kept it all these years. Robert opened the bag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. His expression shifted to one of recognition, then bewilderment. This is the journal I gave you for your MIT application essays. I gave these to several promising students each year. Open it, Michael said softly. Robert did, turning the pages slowly. Inside were dozens of drafts covered with red pen marks, suggestions, encouragements. On the last page was a note written in Robert's distinctive handwriting. Michael, remember that your words have the power to open doors. This is just the first one. I expect you to open many more. Your potential is limitless. Mr. Wilson. The older man stared at the page for a long moment, then looked up at Michael, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. You spent 37 after-school sessions helping me perfect those essays, Michael said, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. You drove me to the MIT interview because my parents couldn't take time off work. You bought my first suit at Goodwill and taught me how to tie a tie. Robert's hand trembled slightly as he closed the journal. I did that for several promising students who needed extra support. It was part of my job. No, Michael replied firmly. It wasn't, and we both know it. I was a 16-year-old kid who barely spoke English when he arrived in your classroom, Michael continued, accepting the coffee cup Mary offered him with a nod of thanks. My parents worked double shifts at the restaurant. They wanted me to succeed, but they didn't know how to help me navigate the American education system. Robert listened intently, lines deepening around his eyes as fragments of memory began to reconnect. You stayed after class, almost every day. Because you invited me to, Michael confirmed. You noticed I was struggling to participate, not because I didn't understand the material, but because I was afraid of my accent, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of being laughed at. Again. He took a sip of coffee, allowing himself a moment to control the unexpected surge of emotion. You created a safe space where I could practice speaking without judgment. You recorded my voice and played it back to me to show me my English was better than I thought. Mary's eyes softened as she looked at her husband. That sounds like Bob. When I told you my parents expected me to attend community college and then help with the restaurant, you were the one who suggested MIT, Michael continued. I laughed, literally laughed, because it seemed so impossible. But you said, nothing is impossible for someone with your mind, Michael. You just need the right doors to open. Robert set down his coffee cup, his expression a complex mixture of recognition and disbelief. The scholarship essay contest. I remember now. You won it. $50,000 toward tuition, Michael nodded. But I nearly didn't submit the application. The day before the deadline, I tried to back out. I told you it was pointless that kids like me didn't get those opportunities. And I told you that was exactly why you needed to apply. Robert finished, the memory surfacing fully now. Because the world needed more voices like yours in places like MIT. You drove me to the post office to mail it. You paid for the certified mail fee out of your own pocket. Michael leaned forward. Do you have any idea how revolutionary that was to me? My whole life I had been told to keep my head down, not to draw attention, to accept my place. Here was this teacher, this American, telling me I deserved a seat at a table I hadn't even dared to look at. Mary reached over and squeezed her husband's hand, her eyes shining with quiet pride. When I got the acceptance letter, my parents were confused. They were proud, yes, but also worried about the cost, the distance, the unknown. It was you who came to our house, who sat at our kitchen table eating my mother's dumplings, who explained what this opportunity meant. You convinced them to let me go. Robert cleared his throat, clearly moved by these recollections. I remember, your mother's dumplings. Best I've ever had. Michael smiled. She was thrilled you thought so. No one outside our family had ever tried her cooking before. But Michael, Robert said, gesturing to the bank letter on the table, all of that, it doesn't explain this. Whatever guidance I provided, whatever small help I offered, it hardly justifies 17 years of payments. Your success is your achievement. You owe me nothing. That's where you're wrong, Michael replied firmly. I owe you everything. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, opening a photo gallery. He passed the phone to Robert and Mary, who leaned in together to look at the screen. The image showed a simple memorial plaque on what appeared to be a university building, the Wilson Scholarship for First-Generation Americans. 10 years ago, I endowed a scholarship fund at MIT in your name, Michael explained. It covers full tuition for 5 students each year, students like me who need someone to open a door. The mortgage payments, that was personal. I learned through a classmate that you were facing foreclosure because of medical bills. Mary's hand went to her throat. That was after my second diagnosis. We nearly lost everything. It was the least I could do, Michael said simply. Every dollar I have, every opportunity I've been given, can be traced back to that classroom where you spent your free time helping a kid who couldn't even properly thank you in English. Robert sat very still, his eyes fixed on the phone screen, processing everything he had just heard. When he finally looked up, there was a sheen of moisture in his eyes. I never knew, he said quietly. All these years teaching, wondering if I was making any difference at all, and you were out there doing all of this. There are others, Michael told him. Not just the scholarship recipients, many of your former students who've gone on to do remarkable things. You planted seeds that grew in ways you couldn't see. A timer chimed from the kitchen, breaking the emotional weight of the moment. Mary rose with a slight wince. That's our lunch. I hope you'll stay, Michael. We have so much more to talk about. As she left the room, Robert stood as well, extending his hand to Michael once more. This time, instead of a handshake, he pulled his former student into a firm embrace. Thank you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Not for the money, for showing me that it mattered. All of it mattered. Michael returned the embrace, finally delivering the thank you he had been trying to express for 17 years. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Lunch extended into the afternoon as the 3 of them shared stories, filling in the 25-year gap between Michael's graduation and this unexpected reunion. Mary brought out photo albums, showing Michael pictures of students from his year that Robert had kept. To his surprise, Michael found himself in several, receiving an award at a ceremony, working intently at a desk, standing awkwardly at graduation in his borrowed suit. I can't believe you kept these, Michael said, touching one photo gently. In it, a teenage version of himself stood beside Mr. Wilson, holding an acceptance letter, both of them grinning widely. I keep track of all my scholarship students, Robert explained. It's my own personal hall of fame. As the conversation flowed, Michael found himself studying Mary with growing concern, though she maintained a warm smile and engaged actively. In their discussion, he noticed how she occasionally pressed a hand to her side, how she sometimes paused mid-sentence to take a careful breath, how Robert's eyes constantly checked on her with quiet vigilance. How are you really doing, Mrs. Wilson? Michael finally asked during a lull in the conversation. Mary's smile faltered slightly. Call me Mary, please. And I'm managing. The doctors are pleased with my progress. Robert's expression told a different story, one of ongoing struggle and uncertainty. Michael recognized it immediately. It was the same look his father had worn during those difficult early years in America. A look that said, "I am carrying a burden too heavy to share, but I will carry it anyway." "The treatments are expensive," Robert added quietly. "Even with insurance, the co-pays and deductibles, well, you know, that's why we were having trouble with the mortgage." Michael nodded, an idea forming in his mind. "May I ask what hospital you're being treated at?" "Cleveland Memorial," Mary replied. "They have an excellent oncology department. Dr. Patterson has been wonderful." The name clicked immediately in Michael's memory. Sarah Patterson specializes in aggressive treatment of recurring breast cancer? Mary's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Yes, that's her. Do you know her?" "Chentech developed the security infrastructure for Cleveland Memorial's patient database," Michael explained. "Dr. Patterson was on the advisory committee. She's brilliant." What Michael didn't add was that Sarah Patterson had also been the recipient of substantial research funding from his company's philanthropic foundation, specifically for her work on treatment-resistant cancers. It was the type of connection that could potentially open doors to experimental treatments, clinical trials, specialized care, opportunities that might not otherwise be available to a retired teacher and his wife, regardless of the quality of their insurance. "I'd like to help," Michael said carefully, aware that he was treading delicate ground. "Not with money," he added quickly, seeing Robert's expression shift toward polite resistance, "but with connections. I know people who might be able to get you access to new treatment options." "That's very kind," Robert began, "but we couldn't possibly—" "Please," Michael interrupted gently, "let me do this. Not as repayment, but as family would do for each other." The word hung in the air. Between them, family. Unexpected, but somehow not inappropriate. In many ways, Robert Wilson had been more of a father figure to Michael during those critical years than his own overworked, overwhelmed father could be. Mary reached across the table and placed her hand over Michael's. "We would be grateful for any help you can provide, wouldn't we, Robert?" Her husband sighed, the struggle between pride and pragmatism visible on his face. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, we would. Thank you, Michael." The conversation shifted then to more immediate practical matters. Michael needed to return to San Francisco the next day for an important board meeting, but he promised to make arrangements for Mary to be evaluated for a promising clinical trial. He also insisted that the mortgage payments would continue. "Consider it a retirement plan you didn't know you had," he said, when Robert tried to object. As afternoon faded toward evening, Robert excused himself to prepare dinner, leaving Michael and Mary alone in the living room. She studied him with eyes that, despite her illness, missed nothing. "He saved you," she said softly, "and now you're trying to save me." Michael didn't deny it. "He gave me a future when I couldn't see one for myself. If I can give you both more time together, it's the least I can do." Mary smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "And what about you, Michael? All these years taking care of an old teacher's problems. Do you have someone taking care of yours?" The question caught him off guard. Work keeps me busy." "That's not an answer," Mary observed kindly. "Robert and I worried about you, you know, after we figured out who you were from the bank letter. We looked you up online. Quite the success story. But no mention of a family, a partner." Michael shifted uncomfortably. The truth was, his personal life had always taken a back seat to his professional ambitions. There had been relationships, but none that lasted when faced with his relentless work schedule and inability to fully open up about his past, his struggles, his fears. "Success came with certain sacrifices," he admitted. "It doesn't have to," Mary said, her voice gentle but firm. "Take it from someone who's faced her own mortality 3 times now. All the success in the world means nothing if you have no one to share it with." Before Michael could respond, Robert called from the kitchen that dinner was ready. As they moved to the dining room, Michael found himself unexpectedly rattled by Mary's observation. He had flown to Ohio prepared to face his past, but he hadn't anticipated being confronted about his present, or more troublingly, his future. The next morning, Michael sat in Robert's study on a video call with Dr. Sarah Patterson. After explaining the situation, with Mary's permission, and leveraging his connection as a major donor to her research program, he had secured her agreement to personally review Mary's case file and consider her for an innovative treatment protocol. "I should be able to get her in for an evaluation next week," Dr. Patterson was saying, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. "From what you've told me, she might be an excellent candidate for the immunotherapy trial we're launching." "Thank you, Sarah," Michael replied, relief evident in his voice. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." "Well, you've certainly done enough for our hospital over the years," she said with a small smile. "Consider this a small repayment. I'll have my office call Mrs. Wilson directly to schedule." After ending the call, Michael sat back in Robert's desk chair, surveying the small, book-lined room. Like everything in the Wilson home, it was modest but thoughtfully arranged. Framed student artwork hung alongside teaching certificates and family photos. One shelf held yearbooks from decades of teaching, an entire career captured in matching. Bound volumes. Michael reached for the yearbook from his graduating year, curious to see what memories it might stir. As he flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fell to the floor. He picked it up and unfolded it to find a handwritten letter from a former school principal, dated just after Michael's graduation. "Dear Robert," it began, "I cannot approve your request for a reduced teaching schedule to pursue the literacy program for ESL students. While I commend your dedication, budget constraints make this impossible at present. Perhaps you might consider these efforts on a volunteer basis, as you've done with your college preparation mentoring." Michael refolded the letter, understanding dawning. Mr. Wilson hadn't just helped him. He had apparently tried to create an entire program for students like him, students navigating the difficult path between cultures and languages. And he had been denied. "Finding pieces of the past?" Robert asked from the doorway, startling Michael. "I'm sorry," Michael said quickly, holding up the folded letter. "This fell out of the yearbook. I didn't mean to pry." Robert waved away the apology and entered the room, taking the letter. "Ah, this. One of many rejection letters I collected over the years. The price of having ideas in an underfunded school district. You wanted to start a program for ESL students," Michael observed. "I did." Robert settled into the armchair across from the desk. "After working with you and several other immigrant students, I realized there was a serious gap in our support systems. Students with tremendous potential were falling through the cracks simply because of language barriers or cultural differences." "What happened?" Robert smiled ruefully. "What always happens in public education: no budget, no time, too many bureaucratic hurdles. I did what I could informally, but it was never enough." Michael turned this information over in his mind, connecting it to his own experience, to the struggles he had faced, to the difference one dedicated teacher had made. "What if it wasn't too late?" he asked slowly. "What do you mean?" "The program you wanted to create." Michael leaned forward, energy building as the idea took shape. "What if we could do it now? A foundation or an institute. Something to provide the kind of support you gave me to other students who need it." Robert's expression was skeptical. "At my age, I'm nearly 70, Michael. I retired from teaching last year." "Which means you have experience and time," Michael countered. "And I have resources. Between us, we could build something meaningful, a legacy that continues the work you started with me." A flicker of interest showed in Robert's eyes, quickly tempered by practicality. "It's a lovely thought, but Mary's health has to be my priority now." "Of course," Michael agreed immediately. "That comes first, but consider it at least something to look toward in the future." Before Robert could respond, Mary appeared in the doorway, a cordless phone in her hand. "That was Dr. Patterson's office," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. "They want to see me next Tuesday for an evaluation. They said I've been personally recommended for a new clinical trial." Robert rose immediately and went to his wife, placing a supportive arm around her shoulders. "That's wonderful news." "It certainly is," Michael agreed, standing as well. "Dr. Patterson is the best in her field. If anyone can help, she can." Mary looked at Michael with clear-eyed understanding. "You arranged this, didn't you?" He nodded, not bothering to downplay his involvement. "I made a call. The rest is between you and the doctors." "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of years of struggle, of hope repeatedly raised and dashed, of a fight that had gone on too long. Michael checked his watch reluctantly. "I should get going if I'm going to make my flight. The board meeting." He trailed off, suddenly finding the prospect of returning to his normal life oddly unappealing. "Of course," Robert said, extending his hand. "You've done more than enough already." Instead of taking the offered, and Michael pulled out his phone. "Actually, before I go, I'd like to show you something." He opened his calendar app and turned the screen toward the Wilsons. "This is my schedule for the next 3 months. Board meetings, product launches, investor calls, the usual CEO obligations." Robert and Mary looked at the densely packed calendar with polite interest, clearly not understanding the point. "I'm going to clear 2 days every week," Michael continued, swiping on the screen to demonstrate. "Tuesdays and Wednesdays. I'll fly back for Mary's appointment next week and I'll stay for the initial consultation. Then I'll return whenever needed for treatments or follow-ups." "Michael, that's impossible," Robert protested. "You can't put your life on hold for us." "I'm not putting it on hold," Michael corrected him. "I'm finally balancing it properly. Mary's right. I've been all work and no connection for too long. Consider this my first step toward fixing that." As he spoke, Michael realized the truth. In his own words, this unexpected reunion had stirred something in him, a recognition of what had been missing in his life despite all his success. The Wilsons had welcomed him into their home, treated him not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a person they genuinely cared about. 2 months after his unexpected reunion with the Wilsons, Michael sat in the waiting room of Cleveland Memorial's Oncology Center, his laptop open on his knees as he reviewed quarterly reports for Chentech. Around him, other patients and family members waited, some scrolling through phones, others leafing through outdated magazines, all of them suspended in that peculiar limbo of hospital time. He had kept his promise, flying to Ohio every 2 weeks, coordinating his schedule around Mary's treatments and consultations. Today was the first major assessment since she had begun the clinical trial, a moment of truth that would determine whether this path offered real hope or just another dead end. Robert emerged from the hallway, his expression a complex mixture of exhaustion and cautious optimism. Michael closed his laptop immediately and stood. "She's getting dressed," Robert said, sinking into the chair beside Michael. "Dr. Patterson wants to talk to all of us together." "That's a good sign, right?" Michael asked, searching the older man's face for clues. "I think so. But I've learned not to get ahead of myself with these things." Michael nodded, understanding. During these past weeks, he had witnessed firsthand the toll that Mary's illness had taken on Robert. The constant vigilance, the midnight medication, schedules, the careful monitoring of symptoms, the brave face he maintained whenever Mary was watching. It was a devotion that humbled Michael, making him question whether he had ever cared for anyone with such unwavering commitment. "Either way," Michael said, "we'll handle it. Whatever comes next." Robert glanced at him, a faint smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "We," he repeated softly. "You know, when that bank letter arrived, I never imagined it would lead to this, that you would become such a fixture in our lives." "Is that okay?" Michael asked, suddenly uncertain. "I don't want to intrude." "Intrude?" Robert shook his head. "Michael, you've been a godsend. Not just the financial help or the medical connections, though God knows those have been significant. But having you here, it matters." Before Michael could respond, a nurse appeared to escort them to Dr. Patterson's office. Mary was already seated when they entered, her face tense with anticipation. Dr. Patterson, a tall woman with prematurely silver hair and kind eyes, sat behind her desk reviewing scan results on her computer screen. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the remaining chairs. Once they were all settled, she turned her screen so they could see the images. "I wanted to show you these in person. These are Mrs. Wilson's scans from 2 months ago, before we started the trial." The screen showed colorful images that Michael didn't fully understand, but the bright areas scattered throughout were ominously clear even to his untrained eye. "And these," Dr. Patterson continued, clicking to a new set of images, "are from today." Even Michael could see the difference. The bright spots were notably smaller, some gone entirely. "The tumors are shrinking," Dr. Patterson confirmed, her professional demeanor softening into a genuine smile. "Significantly, the immunotherapy is working better than we expected at this stage." Mary's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Robert reached for her, his own hands trembling slightly. Michael sat very still, afraid to break the moment, feeling like both an intruder on their intimate relief and somehow fundamentally part of it. "This doesn't mean we're out of the woods," Dr. Patterson cautioned gently. "But it does mean we're on the right path. I want to continue the current protocol for another 3 months, then reassess." "Whatever you recommend," Mary said, her voice steady despite her tears. "We trust you." After discussing medication adjustments and scheduling the next round of treatments, they left the hospital in a state of cautious elation. The spring air felt charged with possibility, the Ohio sunshine somehow brighter than Michael remembered. "Dee, we should celebrate," Michael said as they walked toward the parking lot. "Dinner somewhere nice, my treat." Robert looked at Mary, a silent communication passing between them. "Actually," he said, "Mary's a bit tired from the tests. But if you're open to it, we thought we might grill at home. Nothing fancy, just family time." Family time. The phrase caught Michael off guard, stirring emotions he hadn't expected. In San Francisco, his life revolved around work, business, dinners, networking events, all perfectly orchestrated but fundamentally hollow. Here, in this small Ohio town with these two people who had unexpectedly reclaimed their place in his life, family time meant something entirely different, something real. "I'd like that," he said simply. Later that evening, as Robert tended the grill in the backyard and Mary rested inside, Michael found himself staring at his phone, at an email from his COO marked urgent. Another crisis, another demand for his immediate attention, another reminder of the life he had temporarily stepped away from. He was about to open it when Robert called from the patio. "Michael, could you grab the platter from the kitchen? These steaks are just about done." Michael hesitated, looking from his phone to the house and back again. 2 months ago, there would have been no choice. The email would have taken priority. Everything else relegated to the background of his laser-focused ambition. But now, he set the phone down on the patio table, screen side down, and went to help with dinner. Inside, he found Mary arranging a salad at the kitchen counter, moving, with more energy than he had seen from her before. The positive news from Dr. Patterson had visibly lifted a weight from her shoulders. "Need a hand?" he asked, reaching for the platter Robert had mentioned. "Always," she replied with a smile. "Though I'm feeling surprisingly good today, must be the news or the company." As they worked side by side, the domesticity of the moment struck Michael with unexpected force. When was the last time he had prepared a meal with someone? Not a catered business dinner, not a restaurant meeting, but a simple shared task of nourishment and care. "You know," Mary said, breaking into his thoughts, "Robert has been different since you came back into our lives. More hopeful, more like his old self." "I think that's the good medical news, not me," Michael demurred. Mary shook her head. "It started before today. You've given him something he's been missing since he retired. Purpose, a sense that his life's work mattered." Michael considered this as he arranged the dinner plates. "He changed my life," he said finally. "I'm just returning the favor." "Is that really all it is?" Mary asked, her perception cutting through his practiced deflection. A transaction? A debt being repaid? The question lingered between them, challenging Michael to examine his own motivations more deeply. Was it just gratitude that brought him back to Ohio every 2 weeks? Or was he seeking something he had never truly had? Connection, belonging, family. No, he admitted quietly. It's not just about the debt anymore. I think it might never have been. Mary nodded as if she had known all along. That program Robert wanted to start for ESL students. He's been talking about it again. Drawing up plans, making lists. I haven't seen him this excited about a project in years. Really? Michael felt a surge of pleasure at this news. I thought. He dismissed the idea. Oh, he always does that initially, Mary said with a knowing smile. He needs time to warm up to possibilities. But once he does… She trailed off as Robert entered with the steaks, his face flushed from the heat of the grill. The three of them settled around the dining room table, the conversation flowing easily from Mary's treatment plan to local news to Michael's company. For the first time, Michael found himself talking about his work not in terms of achievements and acquisitions, but in terms of the people involved, the problem solved, the purpose behind the technology. You know, Robert said thoughtfully as they finished their meal, I've been thinking about that ESL program we discussed. What if we started small? Not a foundation, not yet. But maybe a pilot program at Millfield High? Michael felt a jolt of excitement. You mean it? I've still got contacts there, Robert continued, warming to the subject. The current principal is actually a former student of mine. If we designed something focused on college preparation for first-generation Americans with mentorship components and technology integration, Michael added quickly. Remote tutoring options, language learning apps. We could develop something specific for the program. Exactly, Robert nodded, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. It wouldn't have to be elaborate. Initially, just effective. As they began sketching ideas on napkins, Michael realized with sudden clarity that his life had shifted profoundly in the past 2 months. The revelation at the bank, which had initially seemed like a disruption to his carefully controlled existence, had actually been the catalyst for something essential, a reconnection not just with his past, but with parts of himself he had suppressed in his single-minded pursuit of success. Here, talking excitedly about educational outreach with his former teacher, watching Mary's amused participation, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt home. The summer brought new rhythms to Michael's life. He had established a regular commute between San Francisco and Ohio, spending alternating weeks in each location. In San Francisco, he drove Chentech forward with renewed purpose and clarity. In Ohio, he worked alongside Robert developing the pilot program for ESL students while supporting Mary through her ongoing treatments. The arrangement had raised eyebrows among his executive team at first. Michael Chen, notorious workaholic and perfectionist, suddenly insisting on regular absences from headquarters. But as weeks passed into months, they adjusted to the new normal, especially when they noticed that their CEO, rather than becoming less effective, seemed more focused, more decisive, and surprisingly more approachable. What no one anticipated, however, was the email that arrived on a sweltering August afternoon as Michael sat in Robert's study, collaborating on the curriculum for their pilot program. Michael, his assistant's voice came through the speakerphone, tense, with controlled urgency. I've sent you the details, but you need to know immediately. Ashton Reed is making a move. Michael felt his stomach tighten. Ashton Reed, founder of rival security firm NextGuard, and Michael's most aggressive competitor, had been circling Chentech for years, looking for vulnerabilities. What kind of move? Hostile takeover attempt. They've been quietly acquiring shares through shell companies. The board just received formal notification. They're calling for an emergency meeting tomorrow. Robert, sitting across the desk, watched Michael's expression darken with concern. Book me on the next flight to San Francisco, Michael instructed, already reaching for his laptop, and set up a conference call with the executive team for tonight. I need to be prepared before I walk into that boardroom." After ending the call, Michael looked up to find Robert studying him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I need to go back immediately. This is complicated." "Business emergency?" Robert asked, his tone neutral. "You could say that. A competitor is trying to seize control. My company." Michael ran a hand through his hair, the familiar tension of corporate warfare settling between his shoulders. "I've been expecting something like this since we landed the government cybersecurity contract last month, but not so soon." Robert nodded slowly. "So you'll be heading back to San Francisco?" "Tonight, if possible." Michael was already checking flight options on his phone. "I need to be there in person to handle this." "And when will you return?" The question made Michael pause, his fingers hovering over the screen. The honest answer was that he didn't know. Fending off a hostile takeover could take weeks, even months of intense focus and strategic maneuvering. It would require every ounce of his attention, every resource at his disposal. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "This isn't a simple problem. With a quick fix, it might be a while." Robert was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, "Mary's next assessment is Tuesday." The statement landed like a weight on Michael's chest. Mary's treatment had been progressing well, but each assessment carried the potential for setbacks, for recalibration, for difficult decisions. He had been present for each one so far, a support for both Mary and Robert during the tense hours of waiting, the careful interpretation of results. "I know," Michael said, conflict evident in his voice. "I'll try to make it back, but I can't promise. This takeover attempt, it threatens everything I've built. Thousands of jobs, years of innovation, all the good we've been able to do with our success. It's all at risk if Reed gains control." "I understand," Robert said, his voice neutral. "You have responsibilities." Something in his tone made Michael look up sharply. "What is that supposed to mean?" Robert sighed, removing his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Nothing, Michael. It means exactly what I said. You have responsibilities, important ones. We all make choices based on our priorities." "Are you suggesting Mary isn't a priority for me?" Michael felt a flash of indignation. "After everything I've done?" "No," Robert replied calmly. "I'm not suggesting anything. You've been incredibly generous with your time and resources. No one could ask for more." But there was something in Robert's carefully measured response that stung more than any accusation. A resignation, an acceptance that ultimately Michael would choose his business over the connections he had formed here. It echoed, too closely, the disappointments of Michael's childhood, his father missing school events for extra shifts, his mother's tired explanation that work comes first, the gradual understanding that survival trumped presence, that providing was a form of love, even when it meant absence. "I'll be on the first flight back on Tuesday morning," Michael said abruptly, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. "I'll make the assessment, then return to San Francisco afterward." "There's no need to do that," Robert protested. But Michael cut him off. "I said I'll be there. I can manage both." The rest of the afternoon passed in a strained atmosphere as Michael made travel arrangements and fielded urgent calls from his leadership team. By evening, he had secured a seat on the last flight to San Francisco and packed his belongings, ready for what might be weeks of corporate battle. As he prepared to leave, Mary emerged from her bedroom where she had been resting. She looked tired but determined, her diminished physical presence somehow offset by the strength in her gaze. "Robert tells me you're heading back to fight for your company," she said, settling carefully into an armchair. "That sounds serious." Michael nodded, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "It is, but I'll be back for your appointment on Tuesday." Mary studied his face for a moment, then reached out to pat his hand. "Don't make promises you might not be able to keep, Michael. We understand how important your work is." "Both things can be important," Michael insisted. "I don't have to choose." Mary's smile was gentle but knowing. "Life is full of choices, dear. The trick isn't avoiding them, it's being honest about the ones we make." Robert appeared in the doorway, car keys in hand. "We should get going if you're going to make that flight." The drive to the airport was quiet, the evening sky deepening from azure to indigo as they traveled. Michael found himself watching the familiar landmarks of Millfield pass by, wondering when he would see them again, and what might have changed by then. "I meant what I said." He broke the silence as they approached the airport. "I'll be back. Tuesday?" Robert nodded, his eyes on the road. "We'll be here either way." At the departure's drop-off, Michael hesitated before getting out of the car. "Robert, about the pilot program." "Don't worry about that now," Robert interrupted gently. "It can wait until your company is secure." "No," Michael said firmly. "It can't wait. Too many things get put on hold for someday and never happen. I want you to continue developing the curriculum. I'll have my foundation wire the initial funding tomorrow." Robert looked surprised. "You're sure with everything else happening?" "Completely sure." Michael extended his hand. "Partners?" After a moment's hesitation, Robert took it. "Partners." As Michael watched Robert's car drive away, he felt pulled in opposing directions, back toward San Francisco and the company that had defined his adult life, and toward Millfield and the human connections that had recently reawakened, something essential in him. For the first time in his career, he questioned whether victory in the boardroom would feel like enough. The boardroom of Chentech's San Francisco headquarters buzzed with tension as Michael concluded his presentation. To the assembled directors, 3 days of intense preparation had culminated in this moment. A comprehensive strategy to counter Ashton Reed's takeover attempt, preserve the company's independence, and protect its innovative trajectory. "In summary," Michael said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion, "while NextGuard's offer might appear attractive in the short term, their history of acquiring competitors only to dismantle their research divisions and outsource their workforce should concern us all. What they're proposing isn't a merger of equals. It's an absorption that would fundamentally alter everything we've built." Georgia Weber, the longest-serving board member and a former tech CEO herself, leaned forward. "Your presentation is compelling, Michael, but Reed is offering shareholders a 30% premium. That's difficult for many investors to refuse, particularly the institutional ones with fiduciary responsibilities." "I understand that," Michael acknowledged, "which is why my counter-proposal includes the share buyback program and the special dividend I outlined. We're asking shareholders to reject short-term gains for long-term value creation." Marcus Jeffries, another director, tapped his pen against his notepad. "And you're personally guaranteeing the funding for this counteroffensive? That's a significant financial commitment, even for someone of your resources." Michael nodded. "I believe in this company's future. I'm prepared to back that belief with my own capital if necessary." The discussion continued for another hour. Questions about regulatory approvals, legal strategies, potential white knight investors, media management. Michael addressed each point methodically, drawing on the intensive preparation he had conducted with his executive team through the night. Finally, Jeffries glanced at his watch. "I think we've covered the essential ground. Unless there are further questions, I move that we take a preliminary vote on whether to endorse Michael's strategy or continue exploring NextGuard's offer." The vote was unanimous in Michael's favor, a testament to the trust he had built with the board over years of successful leadership. As the directors filed out, offering words of support and confidence, Michael remained seated, suddenly aware of the weight of fatigue pressing down on him. Georgia Weber, the last to leave, paused by his chair. "That was masterful, Michael, but you look exhausted." He managed a tired smile. "Nothing that can't be fixed with a few hours of sleep." She studied him thoughtfully. "You know, in my 40 years in this industry, I've seen many brilliant executives burn themselves out fighting these kinds of battles. It's never just about the strategy, it's about the stamina." "I appreciate the concern," Michael replied, "but I'll be fine." "Will you?" She settled back into her chair. "Your assistant mentioned you've been commuting to Ohio regularly for some personal matter. That was already a substantial commitment before this crisis erupted. Michael felt a flicker of irritation at the intrusion into his private life, quickly tempered by the knowledge that Georgia's concern was genuine. In many ways, she had been a mentor to him since he joined the board years ago. "It's important," he said simply. "Important enough to divide your attention during what might be the most critical challenge of your professional life?" The question hung between them, uncomfortably direct. Michael considered his response carefully. "Yes," he finally said. "In fact, I'll be flying back there on Tuesday morning for a medical appointment, then returning the same day." George's eyebrows rose. "Are you ill, Michael?" "No, not me. It's uncomplicated. Someone I care about deeply is undergoing cancer treatment. I promised I'd be there for her assessment." Understanding dawned in George's expression. "I see. Family?" Michael hesitated. The Wilsons weren't related to him by blood, but over these past months they had become something just as significant. "Yes," he said. "Family." She nodded slowly. "Then you should absolutely be there. The company will survive your absence for a day." As Georgia left, Michael checked his phone and found 3 missed calls from Robert. Concern immediately gripped him. Robert rarely called unless it was important, preferring to text for routine matters. He dialed back immediately. "Robert? Is everything okay? Is Mary?" "She's fine," Robert interrupted, his voice unusually tense. "But there's been a development. Dr. Patterson wants to move the assessment to tomorrow morning. There was a cancellation, and given some symptoms Mary's been experiencing, she doesn't want to wait until Tuesday." Michael closed his eyes, the conflict he had been dreading suddenly upon him. Tomorrow morning was when he was scheduled to meet with the legal team to formalize the anti-takeover strategies, followed by calls with major shareholders to secure their support. The timing couldn't have been worse. "What symptoms?" he asked, stalling for time as he frantically considered his options. "Increased pain, some concerning test results from Friday." Robert's voice was controlled, but Michael could hear the underlying fear. "Dr. Patterson doesn't want to speculate until after the full assessment, but it doesn't sound good." Michael stared out the window at the San Francisco skyline, the familiar vista of his professional kingdom. Below him, hundreds of employees worked diligently, trusting his leadership to protect their jobs, their innovations, their future. On the other end of the phone, a man who had changed the course of his life waited to hear whether Michael would be present for what might be a turning point in his wife's battle with cancer. "What time is the appointment?" Michael asked, already opening his laptop to check flight options. 9 a.m. Michael did the math quickly. Even if he took the red eye, with the time difference and the drive from Columbus to Cleveland, he would likely miss the appointment. But there was another option, one that would require abandoning tomorrow's critical meetings. "I'll be there," he said firmly. "Michael, I know how important your company situation is right now. We understand if you can't." "I said I'll be there," Michael interrupted, his decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. "I'm going to have my pilot prepare the corporate jet. I should arrive in Columbus around midnight, and I'll drive straight to your house." "The corporate jet? Michael, that's excessive." "It's necessary." Michael was already texting his assistant with instructions. "I'll see you tonight, Robert." After ending the call, Michael sat motionless for a long moment. Then he began making the necessary arrangements, delegating tomorrow's meetings to his leadership team, preparing detailed instructions, mobilizing resources to ensure his absence wouldn't create vulnerability for the company. As his assistant, coordinated the last details. She looked at him with barely concealed surprise. "Sir, are you sure about this timing? Mr. Reed is specifically flying in tomorrow to meet with several board members informally." "I'm aware," Michael replied, gathering his documents. "Make sure Marcus and Georgia are fully briefed on how to handle that meeting, and have the car ready in 20 minutes. I need to go home and pack before heading to the airport." As he rode the elevator down to the lobby, Michael reflected on the decision he had just made. For the first time in his career, he had unequivocally chosen a personal commitment over a professional crisis. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. His phone buzzed with a text from Ashton Reed himself. "Heard you're leaving town tomorrow. Smart move. When you return, your company will be mine." Michael stared at the message, feeling the familiar competitive fire rise within him. Reed was clearly trying to provoke him, to force him into an emotional response that might lead to strategic errors. The old Michael would have canceled everything to stay and fight, to prove that nothing and no one could intimidate him. But as he stepped into the waiting car, Michael realized he was no longer that person. The Michael Chen who had spent 17 years anonymously paying a teacher's mortgage had finally reconciled with the Michael Chen who had built a tech empire. And that integrated person had different priorities than either of his previous selves. He typed a brief reply to Reed. "Enjoy your meetings, I'll be back Tuesday afternoon. Nothing will be decided before then." Then he put his phone away and instructed the driver to take him home. Whatever tomorrow brought for Mary's health, for his company's future, he would face it knowing he had made the choice that honored the deepest values of who he had become. The sterile hallways of Cleveland Memorial Hospital had become familiar to Michael over the past months, but today they felt different, oppressive, threatening, as though the very air had thickened with foreboding. He sat beside Robert in the consultation room, both men silent as they waited for Dr. Patterson to arrive with Mary's latest assessment results. Mary herself sat across from them, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her expression serene despite the tension that filled the room. She had always been the strongest of them, Michael realized, facing each new development with a grace that made their anxiety seem almost disrespectful in comparison. "Whatever happens," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I want you both to know how grateful I am for everything." Robert reached for her hand immediately. "Don't talk like that. We don't know anything yet." "I'm not giving up," Mary clarified gently. "I'm just acknowledging reality, and the reality is that you two have made these last months some of the best of my life, despite everything." Michael felt a lump forming in his throat. "Mary!" The door opened before he could continue, and Dr. Patterson entered, her expression carefully neutral as she carried a folder of scan results. Michael had learned to read the subtle cues of oncologists, the way they moved, the angle of their shoulders, the pace of their speech. Nothing about Dr. Patterson's demeanor suggested good news. "I've reviewed your latest scans," she began, taking a seat and opening the folder, "and I'm afraid we're seeing significant progression of the disease despite the immunotherapy." Robert's hand tightened around Mary's. "What does that mean exactly?" Dr. Patterson placed the scans on the high desk where they could all see them. "The tumors that had been responding to treatment have begun growing again, and we're seeing new metastases in the liver and lymphatic system. So we need to change treatments," Robert said, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "Try something else?" Dr. Patterson's expression softened with compassion. "We can certainly explore other options. There are additional experimental protocols we haven't tried, but I need to be honest with you. At this stage, with this pattern of progression, we're looking at managing the disease rather than curing it." The words landed like physical blows. Managing, not curing. The tacit acknowledgement that they had moved from fighting for recovery to fighting for time. "How long?" Mary asked, her voice steady. Dr. Patterson hesitated. "Without further treatment, perhaps 3 to 6 months. With aggressive intervention, we might extend that significantly. A year, possibly more. But the treatments themselves would be difficult, with substantial side effects." Michael found himself unable to speak, the reality of what they were discussing, too overwhelming to process. All the resources he had brought to bear, the connections, the privileged access to cutting-edge treatments, the financial support, none of it was enough to change the fundamental trajectory of Mary's illness. Mary nodded slowly, absorbing this information with remarkable composure. "I'd like some time to consider my options, to discuss this with my family." Of course, Dr. Patterson agreed. We don't need to decide anything today. Take the weekend to talk it through, and we can meet again on Tuesday to discuss next steps. After reviewing some practical matters, pain management protocols, symptom monitoring, emergency contact procedures, Dr. Patterson left them alone in the consultation. For several minutes, none of them spoke, each processing the news in their own way. Finally, Robert broke the silence. Means nothing if it costs you the connections that give life its meaning. As they left the hospital, walking slowly to accommodate Mary's diminished strength, Michael found himself seeing the world differently. The mundane details he might normally have overlooked. The way sunlight filtered through the maple trees in the parking lot, the gentle touch between Robert and Mary as he helped her into the car, the faint smell of approaching autumn in the air, suddenly seemed profound, saturated with meaning. Tuesday morning in the Chentech boardroom felt like entering a war zone. Michael had returned from Ohio late the previous night, walking into a company in crisis. Ashton Reed had spent the weekend aggressively courting board members and major shareholders, spreading promises and subtle threats with equal measure. The stock price had fluctuated wildly as rumors spread, and the financial press was already publishing speculative pieces about Chentech's imminent absorption into NextGuard. The situation has deteriorated significantly, Marcus Jeffries informed Michael grimly as executives and board members filed in for the emergency meeting. Reed has secured tentative support from the Vanderhall Group. Michael felt his stomach tighten. The Vanderhall Group controlled nearly 12% of Chentech's shares. Not enough for control, but a substantial blow to their defense strategy. On what terms? He asked, maintaining an outward calm despite the churning anxiety beneath. They're offering a 40% premium now, not 30, Georgia Weber said, joining their conversation. And guarantees of continued operation of the San Francisco headquarters for at least 3 years. Hollow promises, Michael muttered. They'll gut the research division and outsource production within 18 months, regardless of what they're claiming now. We've seen their playbook with previous acquisitions. We know that, Georgia agreed, but many shareholders only see the immediate financial gain. And speaking of shareholders, she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she needed to say next. What? Michael pressed. There are questions about your commitment, Michael. Your absence yesterday at such a critical moment. Reed has been suggesting that you've lost interest in the company, that you're already looking toward your next venture. Michael felt a flash of anger. That's absurd. I've poured 16 years of my life into building Chentech. No one in this room doubts your dedication, Marcus assured him. But perception matters in these situations. Reed is a master at manipulating narratives. The meeting began moments later, with Michael taking his position at the head of the table. Looking around at the assembled faces, some supportive, others now calculating and uncertain, he recognized the magnitude of the challenge before. This would be the fight of his professional life. For the next 3 hours, Michael led a methodical, passionate defense of Chentech's independence. He presented enhanced countermeasures to Reed's offer, a more aggressive share buyback program, accelerated development timelines for their most promising products, strategic partnerships that would complicate any acquisition attempt. He reminded them of NextGuard's history of dismantling acquired companies, contrasting it with Chentech's culture of innovation and employee ownership. By the time he concluded, the momentum in the room had shifted. Even the more skeptical board members seemed to be reconsidering their positions. Michael could feel victory within reach, fragile, but possible. Then the boardroom door opened, and his assistant entered with an urgent message. Michael excused himself to step outside, already suspecting what he would hear. Robert Wilson is on the phone, his assistant confirmed in a low voice. He says it's an emergency regarding Mary. He wouldn't provide details, but insisted it was critical that he speak with you immediately. Michael closed his eyes briefly, the two worlds he had been trying to balance now colliding at the worst possible moment. Tell him I'll call back as soon as this meeting concludes. It should be less than an hour. His assistant hesitated. He was quite insistent, sir. He said to tell you that Mary doesn't have much time. The word struck Michael like a physical blow. Doesn't have much time. The implication was unmistakable. Mary's condition had deteriorated dramatically, more rapidly than any of them had anticipated. Days had suddenly become hours. Michael steadied himself against the wall, the boardroom seeming miles away despite being just on the other side of the door. Inside, the future of his company hung in the balance. 1,000 employees, millions in shareholder value, his life's work, all dependent on the next critical hours of negotiation and persuasion. And, yet in Ohio, Mary Wilson was dying. The woman who had welcomed him into her home, who had shared wisdom earned through decades of love and struggle, who had helped him see beyond the narrow confines of ambition to the broader landscape of a life well lived. She was slipping away. And Robert, the man who had changed the course of Michael's life twice now, first as a teacher and then as a model of what truly mattered, was asking for him in this moment of profound need. "Get the jet ready," Michael said suddenly, the decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. "Tell Robert I'm on my way." His assistant's eyes widened. "Sir, the board meeting. Inform Georgia and Marcus that I'm handing leadership of the defense to them. They have full authority to proceed with the strategy we've outlined." Michael was already moving toward the elevator, pulling out his phone to make the necessary arrangements. "But sir," his assistant persisted, hurrying after him, "Mr. Reed is scheduled to address the board in person this afternoon. Your absence would be seen as—" "I know exactly how it will be seen," Michael interrupted, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Make sure my car is ready downstairs. I'm going to the airport immediately." As the elevator doors closed, Michael caught a glimpse of Ashton Reed himself, arriving early for his presentation, a look of surprised triumph crossing his face as he realized Michael was leaving. It was the worst possible timing, the most damaging optics imaginable. In that moment, Michael knew with cold certainty that he had likely just surrendered his company. On the private jet flying east, Michael sat alone with this knowledge. The financial press would be brutal. The shareholders would lose confidence. The board, despite their respect for him, would likely have no choice but to accept Reed's offer in his absence. 16 years of building, of innovation, of carefully cultivated vision, all potentially lost in a single decision. And yet, as the landscape below transitioned from western mountains to midwestern plains, Michael found himself experiencing not regret, but a strange, unexpected peace. For the first time in his adult life, he had made a choice with absolute clarity about what mattered most. The cost was enormous, but the rightness of the decision was beyond question. His phone buzzed with a message from Georgia. "Reed sensing blood in the water. Pushing for immediate preliminary vote. We're fighting hard, but without you here." Michael put the phone away without responding. There was nothing more he could do now for Chentech. His focus was entirely on reaching Mary and Robert in time. When the jet landed in Columbus, a car was waiting as arranged. Michael drove himself, pushing well beyond the speed limit on the highway toward Cleveland, trying not to think about whether he would arrive in time, whether Mary would still be conscious, whether he would have the chance to say goodbye. The autumn landscape blurred outside his windows, the familiar route now laden with an urgency he had never imagined when he first traveled it months ago. At Cleveland Memorial, he parked haphazardly near the emergency entrance and ran inside, his heart pounding. The receptionist directed him to the palliative care unit on the 4th floor. When the elevator doors opened, he saw Robert immediately, sitting alone in the waiting area, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and grief. "Robert," Michael called, rushing toward him. The older man looked up, disbelief and relief washing over his face. "Michael, how? You were in San Francisco. The company crisis." "None of that matters," Michael said, embracing his former teacher. "How is she?" Robert's eyes filled with tears. "She's hanging on. The doctors say it could be hours or days. But she's been asking for you. She insisted." "I call you, even though I told her you couldn't possibly—" "I'm here now," Michael interrupted gently. That's all that matters. Can I see her?" Robert led him to a private room where Mary lay amid a cluster of monitoring equipment, her diminished form making the hospital bed seem enormous. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, but as they entered, she seemed to sense their presence, her eyelids fluttering open. "Robert," she whispered. "I'm here," he assured her, moving immediately to take her hand. "And look who else is here." Mary's gaze shifted slowly to Michael, and despite her weakness, a smile touched her lips. "You came." "Of course I came," Michael said, taking her other hand, shocked at how cold and fragile it felt in his. "As soon as Robert called." "But your company," she murmured. "The takeover." "It doesn't matter," Michael told her firmly. "This is where I need to be." A look of profound understanding passed between them. Mary squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left, then turned her gaze back to her husband. "See, Bob? I told you he understood. I told you he was listening." Mary Wilson died peacefully at 3:47 the following morning, with Robert holding one hand and Michael the other. Her final hours had been calm, largely free from pain thanks to the palliative care team, and filled with quiet conversations during her periods of consciousness. Family members had come and gone throughout the day and evening, children, grandchildren, a sister from Cincinnati, each taking time to say goodbye. In the strange, suspended hours after her passing, Michael remained at the hospital, handling practical matters that Robert was too overwhelmed to manage, speaking with the funeral home, completing paperwork, making initial notifications to friends and extended family. It was nearly noon before they finally left, the autumn sunlight seeming inappropriately bright as they walked to the parking lot. "You'll stay at the house," Robert said. It wasn't a question. Michael nodded. "Of course. As long as you need me." The Wilson home felt fundamentally altered without Mary's presence, emptier, quieter, as though the walls themselves recognized the absence of the woman who had been its heart for 4 decades. Robert moved through the rooms like a man underwater, touching objects that Mary had touched, sitting in her favorite chair, picking up and setting down the book she had been reading. Friends and neighbors began arriving almost immediately, bringing food, offerings of help, shared grief. Michael found himself in the unexpected role of gatekeeper, managing the flow of visitors, ensuring Robert wasn't overwhelmed, fielding phone calls, arranging for the funeral service which would be held in 3 days. It was only late that night, after the house had finally emptied of well-meaning visitors, that Michael remembered to check his phone for updates on the company situation. What he found was a barrage of missed calls, urgent messages, and breaking news alerts. The business world was in an uproar over his abrupt departure from the crisis negotiations. Financial analysts were predicting Chentech's imminent acquisition. NextGuard's stock had surged on speculation of the combined entity's market dominance. Most telling was a brief message from Georgia Weber. Board voted 7-5 to accept Reed's revised offer. "I'm sorry, Michael. We fought hard." Just like that, it was done. The company he had built from his dorm room, the innovation engine he had nurtured through market crashes and technological revolutions, the team he had assembled from the brightest minds in the industry, all of it would soon belong to Ashton Reed. The magnitude of the loss was staggering, measured not just in billions of dollars but in unrealized potential, in technologies that might never be developed, in a vision for the future that would be subsumed into a corporate behemoth's quarterly targets. Michael sat in Robert's kitchen staring at his phone, trying to process the reality of what had happened. He had made a choice, and now he was facing its consequences. Consequences that went far beyond his personal fortune, which remained substantial, to impact thousands of employees, partners, and customers who had trusted in his leadership. "Bad news?" Robert asked quietly, entering the kitchen with 2 glasses of whiskey. Michael looked up, surprised to find his mentor still awake. "You could say that. The board voted to accept the takeover offer. I've lost the company." Robert set one of the glasses in front of Michael and took a seat across from him. "I'm sorry, that's a significant sacrifice." "It is," Michael agreed, taking a sip of the whiskey, letting the burn ground him in the present moment. But I made the right choice. I'm where I needed to be. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. Robert processing the beginning of life without his partner of 43 years. Michael contemplating a future dramatically different from the one he had envisioned just days ago. "What will you do now?" Robert finally asked. It was a question Michael had been avoiding, the vast uncertainty of his post-Chentech existence too daunting to confront while managing the immediate crisis. But now, sitting in this quiet kitchen with the mentor who had twice altered the trajectory of his life, the question demanded consideration. "I don't know," he admitted. "I have a non-compete clause that will prevent me from starting another technology company for at least 2 years. I could invest in startups, I suppose, or take some time off. Travel." Robert studied him over the rim of his glass. "Is that what you want? More accumulation? More achievement?" The question pierced through the reflexive planning straight to the heart of the matter. What did Michael Chen want now that the company that had defined his adult identity was gone? Who was he without Chentech? "I've been thinking about what Mary said," Michael replied slowly. "About time being the only resource that truly matters." Thoughtfully. Most people wouldn't see it that way. Most people would prioritize billions of dollars over anything. "I'm learning that most people might have their priorities confused," Michael replied with a small smile. "Maybe so." Claire glanced toward the living room where Robert sat surrounded by grandchildren, his grief momentarily lightened by their innocent energy. "Dad also mentioned your plans for the foundation. He's excited about it, more animated than I've seen him since Mom's diagnosis worsened." "It's still in the early stages," Michael cautioned. "But yes, we're making progress on the concept." "He needs this," Claire said quietly. "A purpose, a way forward. When Mom first got sick 15 years ago, they made a pact that whoever was left behind would find something meaningful to pour themselves into. Mom was always involved in literacy programs at the library, working with refugee families. I think Dad's been wondering what his something meaningful would be." Michael hadn't known about this pact, but it aligned perfectly with everything he had come to understand about the Wilsons, their thoughtful approach to life, their focus on legacy beyond themselves. "I'm grateful to be part of it," he told Claire sincerely. "Your father changed the course of my life twice now. Working with him on this foundation feels like coming full circle." After the last guests had departed and the house was finally quiet, Robert invited Michael to join him in the study. An envelope sat on the desk between them. "Mary asked me to give you this," Robert explained, pushing it toward Michael. "She wrote it the day after we learned her cancer had progressed, when she was considering whether to pursue further treatment. She made me promise to wait until after the funeral." Michael accepted the envelope with a sense of reverence. His name was written on the front in a somewhat shaky hand, the effort Mary had expended to write it evident in each careful stroke. "Would you like me to leave you alone to read it?" Robert offered. Michael shook his head. "No, please stay." He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Dear Michael," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I've moved on to whatever comes next, and you made the choice I hoped you would. You chose connection over achievement, presence over productivity. You chose to be here rather than fighting to preserve what you built. I don't take that sacrifice lightly. I understand what your company means to you, what you've invested in it. But I believe what you've gained in return is far more valuable. The recognition that a life well lived is measured not by what you accumulate or accomplish, but by the lives you touch, the love you share, the moments you are fully present for. Robert saw something in you all those years ago, a potential that went beyond academic achievement or future success. He saw a young man with the capacity for profound impact, not just through what you could build or achieve, but through who you could become. I've had the privilege of seeing that potential fulfilled these past months as you've become part of our family. Whatever path you choose now, remember this. The most important legacy isn't written in corporate annual reports or financial statements. It's written in the hearts of those whose lives are better because you were part of them. Robert and I have tried to live by this truth, and I believe you understand it now too. Thank you for the gift of your presence during my final journey. Now go and build something truly meaningful with the time you've been given. With love and gratitude, Mary. Michael folded the letter carefully, too moved to speak immediately. Mary's words had captured with perfect clarity the transformation he had undergone, from the ambitious entrepreneur focused solely on building his company, to someone who recognized the deeper values that gave meaning to success. She knew, he finally said. Somehow she knew exactly what choice I would face. Robert nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Mary always had remarkable insight into people. She saw patterns, connections that others missed. It's what made her such a wonderful librarian, such a perceptive friend, such an irreplaceable wife. His voice broke on the last word, the composure he had maintained throughout the day finally cracking under the weight of his loss. Without hesitation, Michael moved to his side, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder, as Robert wept openly for the first time since Mary's passing. I don't know how to do this, Robert admitted through his tears. How to go forward without her, 43 years together, and now. You don't have to know yet, Michael told him gently. You just have to take one day at a time, and you don't have to do it alone. They sat together as evening deepened outside the windows, a teacher, about choices defining who we are. Robert nodded, encouraging him to continue. I've spent my entire adult life building a company, building wealth, building a reputation. But I've built very little that connects me to other people, in meaningful ways. Michael traced the rim of his glass thoughtfully. These past months with you and Mary, they've shown me a different kind of value, a different kind of achievement. Connection, Robert offered. Relationship. The things that can't be measured in dollars or stock options. Exactly. Michael looked up, meeting his mentor's gaze directly. I think I want to build something different now. Something that honors what you gave me, what Mary helped me see. Something that creates connection rather than just innovation. Robert's expression softened with understanding. The ESL program? Yes, but bigger. A foundation focused on educational access for immigrant students and first-generation Americans. Mentorship programs, scholarship funds, technology resources, all the things that would have helped me and others like me navigate the system more effectively. As Michael spoke, he could feel the idea taking shape, energy and purpose flowing back into his voice. We could start with the pilot program at Millfield, then expand regionally, eventually nationally. That's an ambitious vision, Robert observed, though his tone conveyed approval rather than doubt. I learned from the best, Michael replied with a small smile. A teacher once told me my potential was limitless. I believed him then about technology and business. Maybe it's time I applied that belief to other areas of life. They talked late into the night, refining the concept, sketching organizational structures, identifying potential partners and obstacles. For hours, they set aside their respective griefs, Robert's raw loss of Mary, Michael's corporate defeat, and focused instead on something new, something hopeful. As dawn approached, Robert finally stood, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. I should try to get some sleep. The children will be arriving this afternoon to help with the funeral arrangements. Michael nodded, gathering their empty glasses. You go ahead, I'll clean up. At the doorway, Robert paused. Thank you, Michael. Not just for being here now, but for showing me that Mary was right, that the seeds we plant can grow in ways we never imagined, long after we've forgotten planting them. Left alone in the kitchen, Michael washed their glasses and set them to dry, moving quietly in the pre-dawn stillness of the house. Despite the weight of recent events, despite the professional setback of historic proportions, despite the sorrow of Mary's passing, he felt something unexpected stirring within him. Not happiness, exactly, but purpose. a clearer sense of direction than he had felt even at the height of his corporate success. Outside, the first hints of sunrise were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Michael made himself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the back porch, watching as the new day gradually revealed itself. In the garden Mary had tended so carefully, late autumn flowers still bloomed, resilient against the approaching winter, their beauty more poignant for its temporary nature. Life moved in cycles of loss and renewal, he reflected. The ending of one chapter making space for the beginning of another. What mattered was not the preservation of what had been built, but the wisdom to recognize when it was time to build something new. The Wilson family home had never held so many people. 3 days after Mary's passing, friends, colleagues, former students, and family members filled every room, spilling onto the porch and into the yard following her memorial service. They came bearing casseroles and memories, sharing stories of a woman whose quiet strength and unfailing kindness had touched countless lives over 6 decades. Michael moved through the gathering, ensuring food was available, drinks were served, and Robert wasn't overwhelmed by the constant stream of well-wishers. He had slipped naturally into the role of facilitator, allowing the family to focus on their grief and remembrance while he managed the practical details. Though many guests inquired about his own situation, the business news of his company's takeover had spread widely. He deflected such questions, keeping the focus where it belonged, on Mary and those who loved her. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, Michael found himself in the kitchen preparing coffee when Robert's daughter, Claire, approached him. "Wanted to thank you," she said, leaning against the counter beside him. "Dad told us what you did, leaving your company in the middle of that takeover situation to be here for Mom. That's extraordinary." Michael shook his head slightly. It was the only choice that made sense at the time. Claire studied him, and his former student now bound by something deeper than that original connection, by shared grief, by mutual understanding, by a common vision for what might come next. Later, as Robert finally retired to bed, exhausted by the emotional demands of the day, Michael found himself drawn to the back porch where he had spoken with Mary months earlier about his solitary life. The night was cool, stars visible through breaks in the cloud cover. The garden Mary had tended now settling into autumn dormancy. He thought about the path that had led him here, from the struggling immigrant student to the tech CEO to this moment of profound transition. The bank letter that had accidentally exposed his 17-year secret now seemed not a mistake, but a catalyst, setting in motion events that had fundamentally altered his understanding of what mattered. Michael pulled out his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, composed a brief email to Georgia Weber and the Chentech executive team. "Thank you for fighting to preserve what we built together. The outcome isn't what we hoped for, but I want you to know that I'm at peace with my decision to be absent during those final negotiations. I've gained perspective that I couldn't have anticipated, and I'm excited about the path forward. I'll be in touch soon to discuss transition details and to share information about my next project, one I hope many of you will be interested in supporting." As he pressed send, Michael felt a sense of closure. The company was lost, but something new was already taking shape from that loss, something that honored both Mary's insight and Robert's original belief in his potential. For 17 years, he had paid a mortgage anonymously, believing that was how he could best express his gratitude for the teacher who had changed his life. Now he understood that the true repayment would come not through financial support, but through carrying forward the values that had defined Robert and Mary's lives: presence, connection, and the courage to choose what truly matters when the moment of decision arrives. 1 year later, the converted warehouse space in downtown Millfield hummed with activity, as students and volunteer mentors worked together at computer stations, study tables, and presentation areas. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the colorful educational posters and inspirational quotes that adorned the walls. At the center of it all, a plaque read, "The Mary Wilson Center for Educational Access, where potential meets opportunity." Michael Chen moved through the space, stopping occasionally to check in with students or troubleshoot technical issues. He had traded his tailored business suits for casual attire that let him work comfortably alongside the high schoolers who came here after classes for additional support. Today, he was helping a Vietnamese teenager named Lynn prepare her college application essays. A full-circle moment that brought a smile to his face whenever he thought about it. "Mr. Chen," Lynn called, waving him over to her computer. "I revised the introduction like you suggested. Does this sound better?" Michael read the paragraph on her screen, impressed by the improvement. "Much stronger. You're telling your story with authenticity now, not trying to guess what the admissions committee wants to hear." "That's what Mr. Wilson always says," Lynn replied with a grin. "Be authentic, not strategic." "Well, Mr. Wilson is usually right about these things," Michael acknowledged, glancing toward the office at the back of the center where Robert could be seen on a video call, likely speaking, with one of their partner universities. In the years since Mary's passing, the foundation Michael and Robert had envisioned had grown from concept to reality with remarkable speed. Using a significant portion of Michael's personal fortune as seed funding, they had established the Wilson Educational Access Foundation, with the Millfield Center as its flagship location. The program combined elements of academic support, cultural navigation, technology access, and mentorship, all the things that would have made Michael's own educational journey less daunting. Students from immigrant families and first-generation American households received comprehensive assistance with everything from language skills to college applications to scholarship opportunities. Robert had emerged from his grief to throw himself into the project with renewed purpose, his decades of educational experience proving invaluable in designing effective programs. Though he still had moments of profound sadness, particularly in the quiet evenings at home, his days were now filled with meaningful work and the energy of young people who reminded him daily of why he had become a teacher in the first place. For Michael, the transition from tech CEO to foundation director had been surprisingly natural. The skills that had served him in building Chentech, strategic thinking, team building, problem solving, transferred readily to this new context. What had changed was his relationship to success. Where once he had measured progress in market share and quarterly earnings, he now found deeper satisfaction in individual transformations, in watching students like Lynn discover their own potential and pursue opportunities they might otherwise have missed. The electronic door chime sounded, and Michael looked up to see Claire Wilson entering with her 2 children in tow. Since Mary's passing, Robert's daughter had become a regular presence in his life, initially checking in on her father but gradually forming a genuine friendship with Michael as well. "Uncle Mike," 7-year-old Emma called, running toward him for a hug while her more reserved older brother followed at a more dignified pace. "Hey, troublemaker," Michael greeted her, lifting her up in a quick spin that made her giggle. "Did you bring me that book report you promised?" "It's in my backpack," Emma assured him. "I got an A. That's my girl," Michael said with pride before turning to greet Claire. "This is a nice surprise. I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow." "For the board meeting." "Change of plans," Claire explained. "Dad mentioned you had that dinner tonight with the potential corporate sponsors, and I thought you might need moral support. Silicon Valley executives can be an intimidating bunch." Michael laughed. "I used to be one of those intimidating executives, remember?" "Exactly," Claire teased. "So you know what they're like." The past year had brought unexpected developments in Michael's personal life as well as his professional one. Claire, a divorced single mother and elementary school teacher, had initially been reserved around him, uncertain about this wealthy former student who had suddenly become central to her father's life. But as they worked together on the foundation, a comfortable friendship had evolved, gradually deepening into something neither of them had anticipated. Their first official date had been just 2 months ago, a carefully managed outing that included both Robert and the children, minimizing pressure while acknowledging the potential they both sensed. They were taking things slowly, mindful of the complexities involved, but Michael found himself more invested in this developing relationship than in any he had pursued during his years as a CEO. "Is Dad finishing up soon?" Claire asked, glancing toward Robert's office. "The kids are dying to show him their science fair projects. He should be wrapping up his call with Stanford any minute," Michael replied. "They're discussing a guaranteed admission pathway for our top students." As if on cue, Robert emerged from his office, his face lighting up at the sight of his grandchildren. Emma ran to him immediately, while her brother followed more sedately, both eager to share their news and receive their grandfather's undivided attention. Michael watched the family interaction with a sense of contentment that still surprised him sometimes. A year ago, he had been at the pinnacle of corporate success, running a billion-dollar company, featured in business magazines, courted by political leaders and industry titans. The loss of Chentech had seemed catastrophic at the time, a professional failure of historic proportions. Yet standing here in this converted warehouse in Millfield, Ohio, surrounded by students receiving the kind of support that had changed his own life, watching Robert embrace his grandchildren, catching Claire's warm glance from across the room, Michael understood with perfect clarity that he had lost nothing of real value and gained everything that mattered. "Mr. Chen," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Lynn looking at him expectantly. "Can you help me with this scholarship essay next? It's for the engineering program at MIT." "MIT?" Michael smiled. "As it happens, I know a thing or two about that particular application process." As he settled beside Lynn to review her essay, Michael reflected on the strange, perfect symmetry of life's cycles. 27 years ago, he had sat just like this with Robert Wilson, a frightened immigrant student with big dreams and limited resources. Now he was playing Robert's role for a new generation, passing forward the gift that had been given to him. Later that evening, as Michael stood addressing a room of potential corporate donors about the foundation's work, he felt none of the nervousness that might have been expected. Claire and Robert sat in the front row, their presence a reminder of why this work mattered so deeply. "Many of you knew me in my previous life as the CEO of Chentech," he told the assembled executives. "You probably also know that I lost control of that company when I chose to leave a critical board meeting to be with a dying friend." A murmur went through about choices defining who we are. Robert nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I've spent my entire adult life building a company, building wealth, building a reputation. But I've built very little that connects me to other people in meaningful ways." Michael traced the rim of his glass thoughtfully. "These past months with you and Mary, they've shown me a different kind of value, a different kind of achievement. Connection," Robert offered. "Relationship. The things that can't be measured in dollars or stock options." "Exactly." Michael looked up, meeting his mentor's gaze directly. I think I want to build something different now. Something that honors what you gave me, what Mary helped me see. Something that creates connection rather than just innovation." Robert's expression softened with understanding. "The ESL program? Yes, but bigger. A foundation focused on educational access for immigrant students and first-generation Americans. Mentorship programs, scholarship funds, technology resources, all the things that would have helped me and others like me navigate the system more effectively." As Michael spoke, he could feel the idea taking shape, energy and purpose flowing back into his voice. "We could start with the pilot program at Millfield, then expand regionally, eventually nationally." "That's an ambitious vision," Robert observed, though his tone conveyed approval rather than doubt. "I learned from the best," Michael replied with a small smile. "A teacher once told me my potential was limitless. I believed him then about technology and business. Maybe it's time I applied that belief to other areas of life." They talked late into the night, refining the concept, sketching organizational structures, identifying potential partners and obstacles. For hours, they set aside their respective griefs, Robert's raw loss of Mary, Michael's corporate defeat, and focused instead on something new, something hopeful. As dawn approached, Robert finally stood, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "I should try to get some sleep. The children will be arriving this afternoon to help with the funeral arrangements. Michael nodded, gathering their empty glasses. You go ahead, I'll clean up. At the doorway, Robert paused. Thank you, Michael. Not just for being here now, but for showing me that Mary was right, that the seeds we plant can grow in ways we never imagined, long after we've forgotten planting them. Left alone in the kitchen, Michael washed their glasses and set them to dry, moving quietly in the pre-dawn stillness of the house. Despite the weight of recent events, despite the professional setback of historic proportions, despite the sorrow of Mary's passing, he felt something unexpected stirring within him. Not happiness, exactly, but purpose. A clearer sense of direction than he had felt even at the height of his corporate success. Outside, the first hints of sunrise were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Michael made himself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the back porch, watching as the new day gradually revealed itself. In the garden Mary had tended so carefully, late autumn flowers still bloomed, resilient against the approaching winter, their beauty more poignant for its temporary nature. Life moved in cycles of loss and renewal, he reflected. The ending of one chapter making space for the beginning of another. What mattered was not the preservation of what had been built, but the wisdom to recognize when it was time to build something new. The Wilson family home had never held so many people. 3 days after Mary's passing, friends, colleagues, former students, and family members filled every room, spilling onto the porch and into the yard following her memorial service. They came bearing casseroles and memories, sharing stories of a woman whose quiet strength and unfailing kindness had touched countless lives over 6 decades. Michael moved through the gathering, ensuring food was available, drinks were served, and Robert wasn't overwhelmed by the constant stream of well-wishers. He had slipped naturally into the role of facilitator, allowing the family to focus on their grief and remembrance while he managed the practical details. Though many guests inquired about his own situation, the business news of his company's takeover had spread widely. He deflected such questions, keeping the focus where it belonged, on Mary and those who loved her. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, Michael found himself in the kitchen preparing coffee when Robert's daughter, Claire, approached him. "Wanted to thank you," she said, leaning against the counter beside him. "Dad told us what you did, leaving your company in the middle of that takeover situation to be here for Mom. That's extraordinary." Michael shook his head slightly. It was the only choice that made sense at the time. Claire studied him. Audience. The story of Michael Chen's dramatic corporate downfall was well known in business circles, often cited as a cautionary tale about letting personal matters interfere with professional responsibilities. "What you may not know," Michael continued, "is that it was the best decision I ever made. Not just morally or emotionally, but in terms of what it taught me about value. Real, lasting value." He gestured to the presentation screen behind him, where photos of the Millfield Center's students appeared in a slideshow. These young people represent the future of American innovation, entrepreneurship, and leadership. But many of them face barriers that have nothing to do with their intelligence or potential. Barriers of language, culture, economic circumstance, access to information, and networks. Michael moved to stand beside Robert and Claire. "A teacher once saw past those barriers for me. He invested time, attention, and belief when I needed it most. The foundation we've built together is about scaling that individual act of faith into a systematic approach to educational access." As he continued outlining the foundation's work and its vision for expansion to additional locations, Michael could see the audience's engagement shifting from polite interest to genuine investment. By the time he concluded, several executives were already approaching with offers of support, not just financial contributions, but commitments of internship opportunities, technical resources, and mentorship networks. The evening stretched late as Michael, Robert, and Claire spoke with potential partners, explaining their programs in greater detail and building the connections that would help the foundation grow beyond Millfield to reach students across the country. It was nearly midnight when they finally left the venue, Claire departing to relieve her babysitter while Michael drove Robert home. They traveled in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the success of the evening. "Mary would have loved tonight," Robert said finally as they turned onto his street. "Seeing all those corporate types getting excited about helping immigrant students, that would have made her day. She would have charmed them all," Michael agreed with a smile. "Had them increasing their pledges before they knew what hit them." Robert chuckled. She did have that effect on people. As Michael pulled into the driveway of the Wilson home, neither man made a move to exit the car immediately, both content to sit in the moment of shared accomplishment. "A year ago, I thought I had lost everything that mattered," Michael said reflectively. "My company, my professional identity, the success I'd spent my life building. I couldn't imagine what would come next. And now? Now I understand what Mary meant in her letter, about the most important legacy being written in people's hearts, not in financial statements. What we're building with the foundation, the students we're helping, the family connections I've found with you and Claire and the kids, it's a different kind of achievement, but a far more meaningful one." Robert placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, his eyes bright with emotion. "From the frightened boy in the back of my English class to this, I always knew you had extraordinary potential, Michael. I just didn't know then exactly how it would manifest." As they walked toward the house, the same modest home where Michael had first confronted Robert about the mortgage payments 17 months earlier, Michael found himself thinking about cycles of giving and receiving, about debts that could never be fully repaid, but could be passed forward in endless, evolving patterns of connection. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Kids are asking if Uncle Mike is coming for pancakes tomorrow morning. Also, thank you for tonight. You were amazing." Michael smiled as he typed his reply. "Wouldn't miss pancakes, and thank you for being there." As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Michael looked up at the night sky above the Wilson home. Somewhere in that vast expanse, he liked to think Mary was watching, pleased with how things had unfolded since her passing. Her life had been defined by connections to her husband, her children, her community. And now, through her influence, Michael had discovered the same essential truth. For 17 years, he had paid off a mortgage, believing that anonymous financial support was the most meaningful way to express his gratitude. Now he understood that the true currency of a well-lived life wasn't measured in dollars or achievements, but in presence, in choices that prioritized people over things, in the courage to rebuild after loss with a clearer sense of what truly mattered. "Good night, Robert," he said, embracing his mentor before heading to his car for the short drive to his own recently purchased home in Millfield. "I'll see you at the center tomorrow." "Good night, son," Robert replied, the word son slipping out naturally as it had begun to do in recent months. Neither man commented on it, but both felt its significance, the acknowledgement of a bond that had evolved far beyond teacher and student into something resembling family. As Michael drove away, he thought about the strange, winding path that had led him here, a path that began with a scared immigrant boy staying after class for extra help and had somehow led to this rich, connected life he now enjoyed. The bank's mistake in sending that revealing letter, which had seemed so catastrophic at the time, had actually been the greatest gift, the catalyst for everything that followed. Sometimes, he reflected, the most meaningful journeys begin with what appears to be a wrong turn, a mistake, a revelation we never intended to make. And sometimes, the greatest achievements aren't the ones we can list on a resume, but the connections we forge, the lives we touch, the love we give and receive along the way. Michael Chen had lost a company and found a family. In the balance of things, he had no doubt which was worth more,